Hi guys, a lot of people asking me things about forge welding steel together in a forge. I'm going to do a little video covering what I've learnt about sticking steel together, just the basics really, and this will go for many steels, carbon steels, mild steels. Some steels are a bit specialist, say stainless and other types which require different specialist treatments, but I'm assuming most people just want to pattern weld steel, stick steel together, make axes, forge knives, the yardie-da-da. So this is how I go about it. And what I've done, I have got a piece of good old thick spring steel there, and that's a piece of mild steel which I've bent and wrapped around, and on this axe, it's a Viking type axe, I'm going for a square head on this one. It's probably more functional, but this will be like a camping style axe where you can use the flat of the head to hammer, to knock pegs in, to whatever. I'm going to show you how it sticks together, as I say. First of all, it's important that you clean the welds up on the steel. The welds have got to be clean, free of grease, free of rust, free of garbage, as best as you can anyway, because any rust spots, hollows or divots that you have in the steel prior to welding will show up in the steel later on. If you grind the steel away to reveal something, or just to shape your steel, you'll see them hollows, and they're called inclusions. And the same goes for rust spots, the same goes for bad weld cracks. Everything is visible later on when you come to work the steel, and a poor weld can also fall apart during heat treating, especially during heat treating and quenching. The blades, steels can sometimes delaminate and crack and split, which, you know, you do a lot of work to get to the quenching stage of something, and just to miss out a few little steps is heartbreaking when the steel cracks, because you've basically got a worthless piece of whatever you've made. So yeah, clean the steel, grind it clean, and then when I'm making these axes, I try and before I start to forge weld, I try to get a good mating face on all these edges, so that everything's as flat as possible. It's not really necessary, but it's certainly a lot easier. And when you're forge welding, I always tack the steel together, because you'll find as the steel heats up and softens, it'll start to move around. And if you belt your steel and your internal billet moves over, you're then going to be correcting it, and your billet's cooling down all the time. Right, so that's the basics of getting your metal prepared. Forge wise, heating the steel is probably a subject on its own, but I use a gas forge, as you've probably seen. I like the gas forge because it won't overheat the steel, and I can kind of control the temperature, and I don't have to mess about with fire, and it's just there and the steel goes in and comes out. This forge runs between 13 and 1400 degrees centigrade, this little forge I've got, which is kind of perfect for welding steel together. I have tried coke and coal and charcoal forges before I set up with this gas forge, and fair enough, coke and coal forges do get the steel a lot hotter, but it's also very easy to burn your steel. And by burn I mean literally burn. The steel will just go off like a sparkler and burn away to nothing. So unless you know what you're doing, coke and coal and charcoal forges can be quite dirty with all the particles and bits and pieces that are floating around when you're stoking into the fire. So you've got to be very careful with coal and coke forges that you don't get slag and crap inclusions within your steel. You need to be constant cleaning down with a wire brush before you put mating surfaces together. The gas forge is relatively quite a bit cleaner. I'm going to fire up the forge. It's important to get your steel up to temperature, as I've said, around 1300 degrees centigrade before you weld, and it's very important to keep your steel at welding temperature. As soon as your steel starts cooling down, it ain't going to stick. So when you come out the forge with your first attempt at welding, you've got to have your heat steel smoking hot, and what you do first is you sort of press the steel together. You're not looking to weld it on the initial attempt. You're looking to bring them mating surfaces together to prepare them for welding. So that's what we're going to do. Get the forge lit. I said all this before I just fired the forge up because the forge is a bit noisy. So I'm going to fire that up now, and I'll go through the rest of it with you. So we've got the forge on, and I'll say this, that the bigger the billet or the bigger the piece of steel you're welding, the longer the heat will stay in that. Obviously the smaller the billet, the thinner, you lose heat at a tremendous rate, particularly when you put it onto the anvil. The anvil sucks the heat out of it. So these are things you've got to watch, and you will see with this initial weld, when I start to tap these mating surfaces together, you will literally see the anvil suck the heat. You'll see the colour change in the metal, and you'll see the anvil suck the heat from the steel. That's why you only get 2 or 3 cracks at this when you first start forging. So you want to weld from one face, then you want to quickly turn it over, because that face is probably already too cool now to effectively forge weld. You want to turn it over and then gently tap the other side back into the forge. These high temperatures are necessary because we're using hammers, hydraulic presses and power hammers and the like. The force inflicted on the steel is tremendous, you know, in some cases 40, 50, 60 ton and above. And in them circumstances, the steel will readily weld together easily because you've got much more force on. But with a little hammer, your force is limited. And when this steel heats up to sort of just below cherry red colour, I'm going to put some borax on. What the borax does, it runs between, it melts, it dissolves, and it turns into a kind of syrup, and it runs down between the layers of steel that you're welding. And what it does, it kind of dissolves any shale that's starting to form on the steel as it's being heated. It keeps that softened fluid, so it keeps the steel clean. And you know, there's a kind of tip, you know when your steel's ready for forging, because if you look at the surface of the steel with the borax on, you'll see the borax sort of dancing around, and someone said it kind of looks like little kids running around in a playground, and it does actually, because you'll see your borax and it'll be kind of skating about and skittering around on the surface with little bubbles, and when you can see that, and your steel's the right colour, you know your steel's ready to start welding with. Another thing about using borax, when you're forging a flat bar, do not trap the borax inside the welds, i.e. don't be hammering the metal around the edges first to try and stick the edges together, because what you'll do is you'll possibly trap a little pool of borax inside the steel, kind of like a sandwich, a toasty sandwich. You'll have molten soft borax inside, which isn't going to be good when you come to clean your steel up afterwards, because it's not going to weld together properly. So what I tend to do is I tend to start at one end of the steel hammering, one side of the steel hammering, or in the centre, and I hit it so I know I'm forcing out the borax out of the sides of the steel. As long as you remember that and allow for that, then you're good. I've already given this a slight little taste of borax, but now it's getting up to temperature. I'm just going to put some more on. You see it bubbling away there on the steel. What it's doing, it's transforming into that really sticky, syrupy layer. You can see there. That's running down between the steel, keeping the steel nice and clean, ready for the weld. I always put plenty on at this stage. Let it get in there. It's so hot, that billet. Yeah, I just put plenty on to make sure down on the anvil and you hear sort of a crack from the steel, and it is a proper real crack. When that happens, you know them two surfaces have mated together. It's like that, and it literally forces the borax out of that surface. So every now and then when you hit it, especially when you first put steel together, if you're only using thin layers, you'll just get a crack. That's your steel binding together. That's a good sound. We like that sound. Then later on, after your next hammering, you'll feel the metal go really solid under the hammer. You know, it feels really nice and solid, and that's when you know your welds are stuck together. And then you carry on with the welding process. It's not done then. A lot of people think it is, but it's not. Okay, can we see in there now? The steel's actually ready to go onto the anvil. That flux is dancing around. You maybe can't see it on the camera due to the intense light in there, the infrared light coming off that steel. I'm going for the first pass on this now. I'm not going to hit it very hard, this steel. As I've said, I just want to force these surfaces together to make sure they're set up ready for welding. You'll see now how the anvil sucks the heat out of the steel. That's it, I'm going to put some more borax on now. There is just set that steel up ready for the next time, but I'm going to hit it much harder and force that steel together. Just keep turning your steel inside the forge. Make sure you get a nice even heat on the steel. Just keep turning around. Watch that flux dance. That steel is now stuck together, but it's not finished with the welding. Back into the forge. Okay, so whenever you forge weld, it's critically important to soak the steel. After your first weld, them two pieces are now welded together with the heat. And there's probably a good mated surface. Really want to fuse them together, so it's very, very important now to let that billet soak in the heat for about 5 minutes. I generally do 5 minutes, sometimes say up to 10 minutes depending on the billet. That's a thick billet, so it's probably going to be more erring on caution, about 8 minutes or so. When I bring this billet out again, I'm going to further really hammer on that weld, make sure that joint is stuck. Soak times are good, gives you a chance to make a cup of tea. Now I knew from the previous step, I could feel that steel under the hammer. I could tell it was welded together. It's something you gain when you've done this a while. It's a bit of experience that you gain. But you just get a feel for the steel and what's happening under the hammer. But I still always carry out this next step just to be doubly sure, because believe me, when you've got say 80, 90 layers, 100 layers of Damascus under the hammer, and you start to manipulate the pattern and the welds open up, it's soul destroying. So this next step takes 5 minutes. Takes a couple of minutes, takes a minute, half a minute under the hammer, and it's well worth it because you just absolutely know that steel is not going to come apart. The longer you leave your steel in the forge, the more shaling you're going to get on the steel when you bring it out. But it's the cost of forge welding. I haven't got good control on this steel because if you see where I've welded the handle onto the axe head, it's very thin. It's not giving me much control over it, but I'm going to adjust that. That's it, and we're done. When I'm welding these, I always take note to just hit that surface there, just to make sure that weld's closed up. It does mean that the steel buckles in a bit there, but I can straighten that out again afterwards. But essentially, them welds are good. That steel is now stuck together really well. And it's now just a case of forging out the steel to the shape you want, squashing it down, etc, etc. That's what I mean. I'm just going to cut that bar there and just get onto this thicker piece of rebar there and then weld that back on. And suck me tea. Just re-welded that, and that's what I should have done in the first place. Welded it to the thicker part of the rebar. Right, well, I'm going back into the forge now because that, as far as I'm concerned, is my last weld. That steel is now stuck together and it should have been put back in the forge to soak, but for this process or this video it didn't. Again, another 5 minute soak while you drink your brew. And now it's just a case of forging out your steel. If you're doing Damascus or you're doing pattern welding, you forge out, and there's one thing I will say: don't forge out the bar too thin, because you lose masses of steel through shale if you do, and I mean masses. You can reduce a thin billet to zero in about 4 or 5 times out the forge. It's gone. Because the thinner it is, the quicker it cools down, the more surface area there is of the steel to shale. So I always try and keep my billets as thick as I can, or as square as I can, you know, rather than drawing them out into long thin bars. That's about it, fellas, really, for forge welding. I'm now going to draw out this axe. I'm going to go under the press now, because as far as I'm concerned, that steel is welded together. It won't come undone after this soaking. No matter how hard you try, you won't be able to break that weld. It's become one homogeneous piece of steel now. So we'll go into the press now, and I'll press that mild steel. I'm going to force it into the spring steel, and I'm going to manipulate the pattern a bit with the dies by sort of stamping it down like a ladder pattern. Then when I eventually grind that axe to the final profile, you'll see the mild steel undulating hopefully in the spring steel. Hope that helped you guys. If you want to try forge welding, if you got any questions, just leave them in the little box below, and I'll see you soon.